just got a shade darker in here. Hello, everyone. My name is Elise. I'll be looking right there. And today I'm going to talk about a topic that I've wanted to for a long time, but I've kind of been putting it off because I didn't know if I wanted what I'm about to say on kind of a ubiquitous level, because there still is a stigma attached to it, and I didn't want my future employment to kind of be potentially impeded or negatively affected by this video. But at the same time, this is what I struggle with. This is part of who I am, and in order to help other people how I would have wanted to be helped when I was really struggling and in the dark and wasn't sure what was happening, I would have wanted videos like this that were organic and very real and honest, because if I kind of skip over a lot of the details, then it won't really be any help to anyone. So before I get into the, I guess, semantics and logistics of what I want to talk about, I will first start by explaining my story. I keep looking every other way, I'm sorry. I just want to kind of give you a brief rundown of who this video is for. Obviously for people with OCD, such as myself, but also for people who know someone with OCD, because I can imagine how difficult it is for you if you don't really know exactly what's going on in their mind emotionally, what's happening physically, scientifically, all at once in the brain. And it could probably be frustrating for you because you don't really know how to advise them, or you don't know where they're coming from, etc. So even if you don't have OCD, I think you could probably get something out of this. So if you want to stay tuned, please be my guest. So I'm going to be talking about OCD as a whole, but I'm kind of going to be zeroing in on my particular form of OCD. And most of the information that I'm going to be spitting out today is from this book called Overcoming Obsessive Thoughts by Christine Purdon and David A. Clark. And it is just very effective. I've read a few books on it, on OCD that is, but none has been as effective as this. There's exercise in it, and I wish I could kind of go through them with you, but in order to keep everyone's attention and have a captivating video, I should probably keep it a bit shorter. But if this video helps you in any way, this book will help you, I think, quite a bit more. So it's on Amazon if you want to get it. So yeah. When I was 19, I started developing symptoms of OCD, which at the time I had no idea were OCD. And before that, I don't think I really experienced too much of it. I had a few weird quirks when I was a kid that could maybe be seen as a preface to my actual OCD. I would do things such as I would see a stop sign, and because stop backwards spells pots, I used to vocally have to say pots, pots. And I would just see my neighbors kind of looking at me with disgust. I think they might have thought I was a bit mentally gone. I would also have to look at the sun. That was from like age 8 to 10. I would always have to look directly at the sun for 2 seconds. So I'm pretty surprised that my eyesight isn't horrible, because one would imagine that's pretty damaging. And one last thing I had that I guess could be associated to OCD back in the day was I would hoard hundreds of deodorant sticks. And I don't know why, I just thought that it would be like a tracking of my life. Like each morning mist or like autumn's night would be just kind of a staple of my year or something. So I would like to save those. And at one point, my mom was cleaning out my room at 16. Yeah, I know, it's embarrassing. And she would open a drawer and just hundreds of deodorant sticks. That's being hyperbolic, but a bunch of deodorant sticks would fly out. And I just remember her one time saying to my dad, "Robert, I think we have a problem." But great delivery. But other than that, I never really experienced obsessive thinking. I apologize in advance that I'm going to keep teleporting because as you can see, I'm not doing this video in one shoot. There's a lot to get through, so my apologies if that's distracting. So I guess this will be a video about ADD now. All right, let's go on. Aww. I've always been a very existential thinker, a introspective person, I guess you could say, even though that sounds very pretentious. But even when I was younger, I would think of, as most people do, what happens when you die, and why do things work the way they do. I'm always trying to be inquisitive, and I guess just learning things that are quite far beyond surface level. But I never in the past would have a thought where it would provoke a lot of turmoil or a negative response or anything like that, because they're just thoughts. They're benign, and that's kind of it.
Stop saying kind of, stop saying kind of, stop saying kind of.
I would just never, that would never be a worry of mine. But 6 years ago, I was in my kitchen, and again, this has never happened before, so it all came as a shock. I was sitting in the kitchen, and out of pretty much nowhere, I felt this unrelenting wave, I can only describe it as, that seemed to just kind of choke me and paralyze me where I was sitting. And for some reason, I started to feel very anxious, and I was alone in my house and just felt vulnerable and just exposed is the only way to say it. And I got my first panic attack ever, and I was so scared and wondering what is going on here. Like, what is this feeling, and why am I thinking of such fatalistic things? So I went downstairs and I was thinking just very fatalistically, such as I'm almost 20 years old right now. This was back then. I'm going to be dead in 60 years. Just all these very dramatic, over-the-top thoughts that are very scary, but usually, as most people and that I would used to do, would just slide on by. The thoughts would just go past, and you would think that was random, let me just go on with my day. But this time I just couldn't seem to shut my mind off, and I couldn't seem to keep these horrible emotions that were reacting to these thoughts at bay. So I was in my room for a little bit thinking and wondering what's happening, and I was feeling very panicky, as I said. So I walked upstairs and I was pacing back and forth, and it seemed like everything I thought or everything I looked at seemed to become a threat. And at that time, as I know now, what anxiety is basically you go into fight or flight mode. So I was extremely anxious, and I was looking around my kitchen, and all the walls started to kind of close in on me, it seemed. And I remember seeing this knife on the table, and my neighbor's calling the cops right now. No, I'm just kidding. And I remember seeing this knife on the table, and I've seen it 1,000 times before. It's been there ever since I was born. But this particular night, I looked at it and became very on guard. And again, my thoughts just started spiraling. It was just anything that came to my mind was not going to be a good thing. And I started thinking, whoa, what if someone came in right now? I guess because I was feeling very exposed and anxious, and my mind was just battling all of these things coming in. I was thinking, what if someone just came in here right now? Like, that could be a possibility. It's not nothing stopping an intruder from walking in here and potentially harming me. But then it went a step further, which was just the start of pretty much, I could pinpoint the exact time that I started struggling. But I thought, what if I'm capable of hurting someone? And when you're little, or even whenever, people get thoughts like, oh my god, this person is so annoying right now, maybe I could like hit them. But you don't think of anything. It's just something that you think of, just like when we get thoughts that are positive, unless we react on them, it doesn't matter. They're just thoughts, they're benign. That's fine. But this didn't seem like it. It almost seemed as though I was going crazy. The second I thought of that scenario, like, wait a second, I just started thinking, why am I even thinking of that? What is wrong with me? Why would I even think about harming someone else? And that was kind of when everything changed. Became so bogged down and just literally terrified of these thoughts that I had no idea what to do. It was a completely new situation for me. As most people know that know me, I'm very outgoing. Usually when I used to have problems, which compared to this seemed very minute at that moment in time, I would talk to someone about it. It makes me feel way better, confiding in people, seeing their point of view, having someone there for me, that kind of thing. But this seemed like one of the only things that I would never talk to someone about because it was so shameful and it was just so out of character that I was just horrified to even think them myself, let alone like utter the words to someone else. That by the way, I was upstairs and I just thought, like, what if I'm capable of like hurting someone? Like, how do you even go about saying that to someone? Because when I was 19, so that was 6 years ago, there was no talk whatsoever about OCD or about these type of intrusive thoughts, which I'll get into later, which they're called essentially. So that was horrifying. So I went to bed that night really hoping that I would wake up and everything will be okay, and it was just kind of a off night, and that would be history. But it was even worse in the morning, and I just walked around for 4 days with my heart beating out of my chest. It was as if there was a lion in the room with me, like, the whole time. Like, I was just horrified. I felt everywhere I went, I would either be hurt or like I would impulsively just hurt someone, which was so ridiculous, but it didn't seem ridiculous because I was getting such a reaction from it. So basically, for a year and a half, I would lock my door, put a chair under it most nights because I was horrified that someone was going to come into my room and hurt me, and I couldn't get this out of my head, and all the what ifs would start coming. Like, what if for some reason I sleptwalked and in the middle of the night I, hurt someone without knowing it, or kidnapped someone, or all these ridiculous, irrational thoughts that were coming to my mind. And I felt like such a horrible person that I pretty much would rather die than have anyone even know that I was thinking these things, because it was so outlandish and just horrible and seemed like I was just an evil person, like, to the core. So I pretty much convinced myself of that. Because who gets thoughts like this other than, crazy people who actually want to do people damage? And, I was just pretty much indisposed for, I think, 2 years. I didn't tell one person. And I almost was acting so much more charismatically because if anyone asked me, I almost would, get very anxious if someone asked if I was okay or something like that. So I made sure always to put up this facade and this front, and to make sure that everyone thought I was okay, because if anyone actually knew what was going on in my mind, I was convinced that people would like send me off to Alcatraz and pretty much just shun me from society because no one was talking about it. The only people you hear that get thoughts like that are psychopaths, and the aftermath of like a murder that goes down, these things like come to light. So I was like, I honestly have no idea what's going on. So here's the thing about OCD, which I'll get into later. Not taking away from anyone that suffers from physical compulsions, such as washing their hands or, making sure everything's perfect symmetrically, that kind of thing. But I think that when you're suffering with mental illness, no matter what kind of mental illness it is, the fact that I think the character of these thoughts were so deep and so dark, it made it so much harder to tell anyone about it. I think that, again, even though OCD sufferers that have to be very clean and are germaphobes, even though it's the same amount, I think, suffering we're going through, I think that there's less stigma going up to someone and being like, hey, I have to be clean from head to toe, and I have to have things very symmetrically or horizontally or just the perfect way. I think there's way less, obviously, taboo behind that, as opposed to being like, hey, I'm kind of afraid and I'm obsessing every day about the fact that it's possible. What if someone hurts me? What if I hurt someone else? That sounds very odd. And people go, what are you even talking about? So I'll try to sum it up. The first person I ever told about it, I didn't even know how to broach the subject because I was so afraid of what she was going to think. I knew her since I was 11, but I'm like, you know what? It's been 2 years. This is getting to be too much. I felt trapped. I had no idea what to do. It was my worst fear to tell anyone this because I was so ashamed. So I basically just told her, gave her the tip of the iceberg, and I'll never forget the way she looked at me. She basically looked at me and said, "You're having thoughts of what?" okay, you're kind of scaring me now. And that was the exact thing I feared. So it was another year before I told anyone else. Again, no fault to her. She didn't have education about it. That's the whole process of why I'm doing this. It's so much better now. There's been so much more progress made. But at that time, I almost felt like my world was going to be shattered, because I was like, yeah, you're confirming it. I am a monster, pretty much. And it got so bad when I was 21 that I took a chance with one other person. He taught me in university, and he kind of just exuded this very compassionate vibe and understanding, and he just seemed like a really good person. And I thought, you know what do I have to lose? And I remember I actually had to give him a note because I was so nervous and I was so panicky, and I could hardly talk, and I genuinely thought that he might have kicked me out of class. And again, I didn't even tell him the nature of my thoughts. I just said that was just the fact that I had OCD and it was verging on depression, and I was getting thoughts that I couldn't get out of my head that weren't the best. And I had built it up and assumed just from that one encounter and the nature of these thoughts that he would just kick me out. But, you know, he was luckily one of the nicest people I've ever met, and he took me to the hospital that day. And that's kind of when I started opening up a little bit, even if it was only through one person. But that was kind of the start of acknowledging the disease itself and trying to get help, essentially. And it's been a long road, but yeah. And eventually it manifested, the thought itself and the compulsion itself manifested into, you know what? I was just sitting on the bus one day, and it kind of changed from, what if you hurt someone else, strictly to, no, what if you hurt yourself? And then again, just like before, it clicked. I thought, that's true. I would never hurt anyone I ever loved, or I never hurt anyone but myself. I can see that becoming a thing, because that's more reasonable. And then not only would I be getting rid of a threat, which I consider myself, I would end all this pain that's just been completely unbearable for, 2 to 3 years. So that pretty much became the focal point of my obsessions, and everything went around it. And it got so bad, it would get to the point where the only few times that my compulsions became physical, and that I would actually have to act on the compulsions, would be, for example, when I was trying to convince myself that I would never do something to harm myself. And to test that, I would go on a bridge and I would look down for 10 minutes and go, okay, you'll never do it. You'll never hurt yourself. But then I would walk away and I'd go, but what if you did? And this never ending cycle, it just would not end, and I had no idea what to do. So I was very fortunate to find someone that was as compassionate and caring as him, because if I didn't, I really don't know where I'd be. So that just goes to show that, you could get it wrong the first time, the first couple of times, but there's going to be someone who understands you and has compassion and a heart and is willing to understand you before throwing you under the bus. All right, so enough about me for a while in terms of my story. I just want to get into, I guess, the actual facts about OCD, at least in terms of the OCD I have, for starters. So when people think about OCD, at least in my opinion, or at least in my experience, a lot of people, when they find out I have OCD or I tell them or whatnot, almost exclusively the response I get will be, I didn't take you as someone that was clean or orderly. You're kind of a slob. Actually, only a few people have said that, but it's true, I'm not that clean. But that's kind of something that irks me, because actually 20 to 25% of people that have OCD don't suffer physical compulsion. So let me just break that down. If you think of really kind of notorious characters for being OCD, you could think of Jack Nicholson as good as it gets. He's jumping over the sidewalks, and he has to have his bacon in a little baggie. He has to have everything very correct and on. Or you'll think of Howie Mandel, who, if he touches a railing or something, will have to shower and just obsessively clean himself, or do a fist bump, that kind of thing. So there's two types of compulsions, and basically what a compulsion is an act or a thought that you engage in that tries to combat the obsession you're having. So basically what that means is if you are getting a thought that you really are not comfortable with, that's causing you a lot of anxiety, how you're going to get rid of that is to engage in a compulsion, which either will manifest as a thought or an action to try to get rid or neutralize that obsession. So there's two different types, as I was saying. There's covert compulsions, which are cognitive, meaning they're always just manifesting in your mind, and that's the type that I suffer from. People that just have cognitive compulsions that are taking place in their mind. That's called pure O. So basically what that stands for is purely obsessional disorder, which is kind of confusing because we do have the compulsions, but that's just what they call it, I guess, to differentiate. So we do still have the compulsions, but they only take place in our mind. So for example, if someone with physical compulsions gets their hands dirty, just how they have that urge to wash it off, if we get a thought of, hey, what if I jump in front of the SkyTrain tracks right now? Or what if I just randomly in the middle of the street shout it out like, Heil Hitler, or something like that. Yeah, it's fun times. So you think it's the same thing about if you get your hands dirty. If you feel this kind of, or if you have this thought of, what if I say this thought out loud, immediately most people just laugh it off, but people with OCD, with pure obsessional OCD, will go, oh my god, what if I did that? Okay, so now I need to convince myself that I'm not going to do that. Because what OCD is basically you're trying to affirm 100% that this thing isn't going to happen, which again, there's the trick, is that you can never be 100% sure, but that's what we're driving at. So here's pretty much how it manifests on paper. You start off with the obsessional thought, then next you go for the overreaction of the meaning of the thought, then comes a lot of distress and anxiety, then comes the neutralizing compulsion. This is where the compulsion comes in. So then this is where the compulsion comes in, and this is where you get very hypersensitive to what it all means. I know I'm just showing you a circle, but I thought it would help. And then basically after the hypersensitivity and you thinking you're a horrible person and doing all the possible compulsions you can, it's never enough, so it goes back and forth. And what I'll get into later is basically, mostly for OCD, how we try to stop this is by cognitive behavioral therapy, which is actually the opposite of what most people with OCD do. We're trying to expose the sufferer to the thought, but instead of using a compulsion to neutralize it, we try to just let the thoughts go, to try to sap the meaning from them. But then there's overt compulsions, which most people think of. It's when you are constantly washing your hands, when you can see people doing these kinds of things, when people are checking their doors, or making sure that their shoes have absolutely zero dirt on them, those types of things. So those are the two different types of compulsions. And before I get into what obsessions are and how those kind of take form and all of that, I'll just keep going on with the compulsions. So there's 4 different ways kind of compulsions can show themselves as well. One is avoidance. So I definitely experienced this when I first started having obsessions. So for example, let's just stick with the idea of, what if I do something to myself? What if I do something to someone else? The what ifs would always be in there. So in terms of my own personal avoidance, I would try to avoid going to places with tall buildings, bridges, if someone asked me to go to the gun range, forget it. I'm just gonna be a basket full of nerves. I would have been, because again, I'm gonna wonder, but what if I do this? And my friends that used to ask me to go travel, I would not feel comfortable with that, because I'd try to avoid any situation in which I would put myself in any type of danger. And that can, again, reinforce the OCD itself, because you're basically giving it power without even realizing it. And that's kind of the trouble with the cycle as well. Also, number 2, trying to convince yourself that the thought's unimportant. I would get that all the time. So basically, I would always tell myself, this thought doesn't mean anything. This is not who I am. But And I would even sometimes like subtly ask friends, like, hey, if you think about, X, Y, and Z, that doesn't mean anything, right? Usually that I have no idea what I was talking about. But again, this reassurance, constantly trying to convince yourself you're a decent person, at least in terms of the OCD I struggle with. Self-criticism, again, that's half the battle. I would always be making fun of myself, self-hate, doing things to purposely keep me unhealthy because I didn't think I deserved it because the thoughts that were running through my mind, and distraction. That's why so many people that have mental health issues are addicted to this, that, and the other thing. Usually someone that has kind of obsessive relationships with their thoughts, in order to escape, inevitably they'll wind up using substances. So now that we've talked about compulsions, let's go on to obsessions. What is causing us to go to such lengths to combat a thought? What exactly is an obsession, other than the fact that once you have it, it's nearly impossible to think of anything else? Obsessions are basically thoughts, images, or perceived impulses that seem very contrary to your character, and ones that you find almost impossible to control or manipulate in any way. So you basically feel overwhelmed and pretty much helpless. This can come in three forms, no matter if you suffer from overt compulsions or covert compulsions, it doesn't matter. There's three ways that obsessions usually manifest. It's through like language or phrases in your mind, such as what if, which is pretty much my middle name. The second one is images, so just an image of something that you don't want to be thinking about or picturing. And the last one is an impulse, and at least what I think is a perceived impulse, basically that we feel like we have to do something because we think of it so often, and because our compulsions aren't working, what is the other option? But obviously that never happens, and we just keep going through the cycle over and over again. In terms of PURO, so purely obsessional disorder, there's three type of obsessions that almost every single person falls into one of these categories. The first one is repugnant obsessions, which I actually fall into, which could basically be defined as something that's centered around a violent theme, such as you're afraid you're accidentally going to hurt someone, you're going to hurt yourself, you're going to randomly run a stranger over, that kind of thing. Really, really happy things. The second one is sexual obsession. So this could revolve around or center around, for example, even though you know you're straight, you keep saying, what if I'm a lesbian? Well, am I living the wrong life? I could be a lesbian. So you'll constantly be obsessing about that. Or what if I like children? Or do I like old people? Will I take advantage? Like all of these type of things. So that's the second one. And the last one is religious obsessions. So someone who's religious, it could be something as if they're afraid they're going to yell something out in church, or that they think, Jesus is going to send them to hell, or Buddha's not going to be happy because of so-and-so reason, that they're not praying enough, that they're sinning too much, etc. So those are the three main categories. So why do thoughts with people with OCD become obsessions as opposed to just transient thoughts like most people? The reason for this simply can be put, I guess, in this video. People with OCD engage in catastrophic inflation of responsibility of that thought. So what that means is basically no matter how small the probability is that you're going to do something. Say, for example, if you're convinced that if you get in the cockpit of a plane, you're going to take the plane down, even though there's like 0% chance of that happening. If you get the thought and you keep reacting to the thought, you feel like you're going to be responsible for preventing it, and you feel horrible if you don't, in your own way, kind of have these compulsions to try to atone for the fact that you keep having this thought, and you think that the more you think about it, the less likely that the event will actually take place, which isn't true, but you kind of convince yourself of that pattern. We also overestimate the threat. We think that even worrying or thinking too much about a certain thought will make it come true. But as I say, there's way more in the book about this, so I'll try to just touch on a few more points. Now, this might be one of the most, if not the most important take-home message from this video, is that pretty much everyone on earth, unless they're a vegetable or Tom Hanks, has blasphemous thoughts. According to this book, every one of us has at least 3,000 random thoughts a day even. So the expectation that all of those thoughts will be pure and good is just very unlikely and not true. If you have two people driving the same road, they're both driving side by side. One of them thinks, oh, what if I just swerve over and hit this old lady with a cane? This first driver will think, oh, well, obviously I would never do that. It's ridiculous. Laugh, keep driving. Second driver, though, thinks the exact same thing, thinks the exact same thought, but then thinks, wait a second, why did I think, what if I'll hit her? What am I, a psycho? Like, what is wrong with me? What would even provoke me to think such a thing? It's the same thought. It comes from the exact same thought process. Doesn't make one person worse than the other, but one reacts way more strongly to it. If every single person acted on their thoughts, we'd have way more people in jail, or we'd have way more Martin Luther Kings of the world, because people would actually put their thoughts into motion instead of just being idle with them. So I was so ashamed and so afraid of what people would think since I was getting these thoughts that the more I dissected it, the more I felt, wow, I clearly am just a bad person. As I like to say, which a lot of other people probably say, we are acting rationally to irrationality. Clearly, my biggest fear was that I was some type of soon-to-be murderer, or just some type of very immoral person. But that's actually the opposite if you break it down, because sociopaths and psychopaths and the like, they get pleasure on thinking these things, and they get excited about it, and they plan things. It's actually the opposite for people with OCD. We're so disgusted and paralyzed by this thought. Obviously, we don't want to do it, but that's not really the way we interpret it, because our mind's going a million miles per hour. We're convincing ourselves we're horrible, and we're convincing ourselves that we're bad, because this is kind of a rare thing to have, right? There's a quote from Eckhart Tolle I really like. He's the author and spiritual teacher of The Power of Now, and this quote I really liked because it rang true to this exact point I was just making. We have to strive for the newfound ability to rise above thought and realize a dimension within ourselves that's infinitely more vast than thought. You then no longer derive your identity, your sense of who you are, from the incessant stream of thinking you take to be yourself. What a liberation to realize that the voice in my head is not who I am. So this was a very refreshing thing to realize. So just remember this: if you're about to judge someone who just told you they have these type of obsessive thoughts, if you're watching this video and you just started experiencing these symptoms and you're wondering, am I completely losing my mind? You're actually acting very moral to a thought that you're just becoming immersed with because of the things I've explained before this. It's just a chemical imbalance that's making us go through this loop day after day after day. And the only way we're going to break this cycle is to realize where it's coming from, what it actually means, that it's not even nearly as destructive as we think, and that it is totally manageable if we do the correct steps. So the last thing I'm going to go over, predictably, is what is the solution now? So the approach to treatment taking in this book is cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. Basically, the assumption and theory behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that all thoughts and feelings are interconnected. So basically, if you view a situation as unbalanced, then your emotional reaction will be unbalanced. You can't change your immediate feelings, but the only choice we have is to kind of accept them, and the goal is to examine and correct these thoughts. As the cognitive behavioral model explains in the good old book, obsessions become more debilitating and frequent and upsetting when you give them faulty appraisals, such as the neutralizing acts or the compulsions and control strategies you think are working, but they're actually digging you in a bigger hole. So basically, when you're going through this book or these exercises, or if you ever get cognitive behavioral therapy, essentially what they're doing is trying to get you to experience your obsessional thought and then trying to change your behavior to it. And it sounds, and it is way harder than it sounds, but honestly, once you make it a habit to depersonalize these thoughts, it almost becomes natural for them to be more discouraged and for you to latch onto them a bit less, because your emotional response is no longer heightened, but it's actually descending. And that's really the goal at the end of the day. But again, trust me, I know it is very hard to do, and it's not like I'm still immune to it. I still get very intense thoughts sometimes. But again, if you have these tools and you realize that it will eventually be okay, it makes the process a bit easier. It's definitely true that the more you avoid your obsessions, the more they kind of get the better of you, which makes sense if I use an analogy such as there's someone named Stefan who's afraid of spiders, and he goes into a room of spiders. Obviously, his anxiety is going to spike quite a bit, but an hour later, when he remains in the room, his anxiety won't be as high. He'll have the opportunity to learn things about the spiders he's never learned before if he never exposed himself to them in the first place. As terrifying as that sounds, instead of fighting the thought and right when you get it thinking, I'm horrible, I'm this, I'm that, this is what I have to do, try your very best not to act on the compulsion, because that'll keep reinforcing that addiction that you need to keep battling it, like an eye for an eye, obsession with a compulsion. Once that compulsion is gone, or at least limited, or not fully exhausted to the point that you've been doing it before, the obsession will become less and less and less and less strong until it's overpowered and then neutral. And then hopefully that's a good starting point, right? So before I go, I just wanted to say, everyone I think at some point in their life has anxiety or gets obsessed with something. And people with OCD aren't the only ones that sometimes are forced to see and think in black and white and become, obsessed and zeroed in on one particular thing. I think that whether it's work or relationship or your goals or ambition or whatever your culture kind of emphasizes, there always going to be some type of anxiety that you find yourself dealing with. So my advice is pretty simple, I guess, because it's one of the only things that has worked for me thus far. One of my favorite books, Infinite Jest, there's a quote from it that will maybe help sum up my point. No single individual moment is in and of itself unendurable. What is undealable with is the thought of all the instances in your life lined up and stretching ahead, glittering. That quote really stuck with me, because to live their life twice and to think of things in the future that haven't happened yet and to try to plan around these things and the what ifs and what if I don't do that and what if I do this. Even today, for example, I've been unemployed for a month and a half, and probably for at least 90% of that time, in all honesty, I've just been obsessing about the fact that I don't have a job. I've been doing nothing really constructive. And today, I kind of use this technique. I saw all these days lined up and all these things that I'm going to have to do, and you're just paralyzed by it. But instead of looking that far ahead and all of these kind of days and things lined up, just try to take it as, that's one of the oldest pieces of advice in the book, I guess, but a day at a time. And on a more personal note, although I don't know how this video could get any more personal, those of you suffering, just please, please, please hang in there. I know too well how incredibly debilitating and disturbing and just outright frightening this disease can be. And I just want to do my best to make sure you're provided with the information that I was lucky enough to stumble upon. In terms of moving forward, as I said, cognitive behavioral therapy is a great start. Discuss with your doctor your options in terms of medication. And most hospitals offer inpatient treatment depending on where you live. But regardless of all that, I'm here if anyone needs anything. I know how difficult it is to approach people on this topic, but I hope one day, just as I have, you're able to accumulate the courage and the optimism and support needed to be honest about this disease, because I think the more we talk about it, the more we're gonna minimize the negative projections behind it, and I think we're already doing that. So thank you so much for watching, and if any of you has any more questions, just shoot me an email on this YouTube channel, and To end with another quote by my favorite author, David Foster Wallace: "You might consider how escape from a cage must surely require, foremost, awareness of the fact of that cage." And I really, really hope that I've said something that may help you get out of that cage. Thank you so much for listening, and stay strong, stay kind, and keep going. Much love. Bye, everyone.